The morning of November 18, 1943, over Rabaul Harbour in New Britain. Second Lieutenant Robert Westbrook pushed his throttles forward, feeling the twin Allison engines of his P-38 Lightning respond with their characteristic deep rumble. Below him, through broken clouds at 12,000 feet, he could see the Japanese airfield at WWII and the anchorage beyond, crowded with enemy shipping. The mission briefing had been straightforward. Escort the bombers in, keep the Zeros off them, get everyone home. What happened in the next 4 minutes would change everything Westbrook thought he knew about air combat. A formation of Mitsubishi A6M0s rose to meet them, climbing in their trademark loose V formation. Westbrook had seen Zeros before. Every American pilot in the Pacific had heard the stories. The Japanese fighter could turn inside anything the Americans flew. It could climb faster than seemed physically possible. In the hands of experienced pilots, men who had been flying combat since China in 1937, the Zero was the most feared fighter aircraft in the Pacific theater. Westbrook rolled into his attack, diving from altitude with his wingman locked in tight formation. The lead Zero began its turn, exactly as expected. Japanese pilots always turned. Their doctrine, their training, their entire tactical philosophy was built around the dogfight. The turning fight where superior maneuverability decided the outcome. But Westbrook didn't follow the turn. He held his dive, watching his airspeed build past 300 miles per hour, then 350. His gunsight Pipper tracked across the sky, leading the Zero by what looked like an impossible margin. At 400 yards, still closing, he pressed the trigger. The P-38 shuddered as 450 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon opened fire simultaneously. The convergence pattern had been set at exactly 400 yards during the armament check that morning. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The Zero didn't gradually lose pieces or trail smoke, it simply disintegrated. One moment it was a functioning aircraft, the next it was tumbling wreckage falling toward the harbour below. Westbrook pulled out of his dive, his hands shaking slightly on the control yoke. He had been firing from a range where he could barely see the enemy aircraft clearly. Every instinct, every hour of training, told him he should have held fire until he could see the individual panel lines on the Zero's fuselage. But the armament officer's insistence on that specific convergence setting, the rigid discipline of not chasing Japanese fighters into turning fights, and the raw kinetic energy of 6 weapons firing into a single point in space 400 yards ahead of his aircraft had just proven something profound. The Americans didn't need to turn with the Zero. They didn't need to match Japanese maneuverability. They needed to understand ballistics, patience, and the devastating mathematics of convergence patterns. The question that would define the next 2 years of air combat in the Pacific had just been answered, though few yet understood it. Could systematic gunnery and tactical discipline defeat superior agility? The Japanese were about to discover that the answer would reshape every assumption they held about fighter combat. To understand why convergence patterns at 400 yards seemed revolutionary, you must first understand what Japanese naval aviation had become by 1943. The men flying Zeros over Rabaul that morning weren't novices. Many had logged over 1,000 hours of combat time. They had flown over China, attacked Pearl Harbor, swept British and Dutch forces from Southeast Asia, and dominated the skies from the Solomon Islands to the Dutch East Indies. Japanese fighter doctrine was built around a single principle, the turning dogfight. Everything about the Zero's design reflected this philosophy. The aircraft weighed barely 4,000 pounds empty. American fighters weighed 7,000 to 9,000 pounds. This weight difference translated directly into turning radius. In a sustained turn at combat speeds, the Zero could complete a full circle in roughly half the diameter of an American fighter. Japanese pilots trained endlessly in acrobatic maneuvers, practicing the barrel roll, the Immelman turn, and the split S, until these movements became instinctive. The tactical manual issued to Zero pilots was explicit. Engage enemy fighters in close combat. Use superior maneuverability to achieve a firing position on the enemy's tail. close to minimum range before firing. The manual specified firing ranges of 50 to 150 yards, distances where even a brief burst from the Zero's two 20mm cannon and two 7.7mm machine guns could inflict catastrophic damage. This doctrine had proven devastatingly effective in the war's first 18 months. Over the Philippines, in December 1941, Japanese pilots had achieved kill ratios of 10-1 against American defenders. Over Java and Sumatra in early 1942, they had destroyed Allied air power with surgical precision. The famous Burma volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, had survived only by refusing to dogfight, implementing hit-and-run tactics that Japanese pilots viewed as cowardly. But doctrine was only part of the equation. Japanese pilot training before the war had been extraordinarily rigorous. Student pilots flew for 2 to 3 years before being considered combat-ready. They accumulated 500 to 700 flight hours in training, far more than their American counterparts. The emphasis was on stick and rudder skills, on feeling the aircraft respond to the slightest input, on instinctive knowledge of the flight envelope. By 1943, the best of these pilots had accumulated combat experience that dwarfed anything American aviators could match. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, who would survive the war as Japan's third-ranking ace with 64 victories, later described the mindset. "We believed ourselves invincible in close combat. No American pilot could turn with us. No American aircraft possessed our agility. Victory came to the pilot with superior skill and the courage to close to killing range." This belief wasn't arrogance. It was based on repeated validation in combat. American pilots in 1942 had indeed tried to dogfight Zeros. The results had been catastrophic. The mathematical reality of turning radius, combined with superior Japanese pilot skill, had produced predictable outcomes. American aircraft burned and fell. American pilots died or spent the war in prisoner camps. The lesson seemed clear: never dogfight a Zero. What the Japanese didn't yet understand was that American tactical doctrine was evolving, not around matching Japanese maneuverability, but around making maneuverability irrelevant. The United States Army Air Forces and United States Navy entered World War II with gunnery training that can only be described as rudimentary. Student pilots received perhaps 10 to 15 hours of air-to-air gunnery instruction during their entire training pipeline. They fired at towed sleeves, fabric targets dragged behind other aircraft in straight and level flight. The ranges were typically 200 yards or less. The emphasis was on seeing tracer rounds and walking them onto the target. This training bore almost no relationship to actual combat conditions. Real enemy fighters didn't fly straight and level. Real enemy pilots took evasive action. Real combat occurred at closing speeds of 500 to 700 miles per hour, where the firing window lasted perhaps 2 to 3 seconds. The deflection angles, the lead required to put bullets where the enemy aircraft would be rather than where it currently was, demanded mathematical precision that few pilots possessed. The aircraft themselves compounded the problem. Early American fighters carried weapons in various configurations, mounted in the wings, in the nose, along the fuselage. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk mounted 650 caliber machine guns in the wings, 3 per side. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt eventually carried 850 caliber machine guns, 4 per wing. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat, the Navy's primary carrier fighter in early 1942, had 650 caliber machine guns distributed across the wings. Each gun fired along its own trajectory. Without convergence, the 6 or 8 individual streams of bullets created a dispersed pattern dozens of feet wide at combat ranges. Most rounds passed harmlessly around the target. The density of fire, the number of bullets actually striking the enemy aircraft, was pathetically low. Combat film from early Pacific battles showed American pilots firing long bursts at Japanese aircraft and achieving nothing. The tracers curved past the target. The enemy aircraft flew away undamaged. American pilots returned to base frustrated, convinced their weapons were inadequate. But the weapons weren't inadequate. The ballistic performance of the Browning M250 caliber machine gun was exceptional. Each round weighed approximately 1.6 ounces and left the barrel at roughly 2,800 feet per second. At 400 yards, the bullet retained devastating kinetic energy. A single .50 caliber round could penetrate the Zero's lightweight aluminum structure, pass through internal components, and exit the opposite side of the aircraft. The problem wasn't the weapon. The problem was getting multiple weapons to fire at the same point in space. Convergence was the solution, though implementing it systematically took time. The principle was straightforward: angle each gun so its trajectory intersected with the others at a specific range. If you set convergence at 300 yards, all guns would fire at a point in space 300 yards directly ahead of the aircraft. At that precise range, the bullet streams overlapped, creating a cone of destruction perhaps 6 feet in diameter. Inside that cone, the density of fire became overwhelming. The mathematics were complex but manageable. Armament officers used surveying equipment to sight each gun, adjusting its mount until the bore axis pointed at the convergence point. The adjustments were measured in milliradians, tiny angles that produced significant changes in impact point at combat ranges. A gun angled inward by 50 milliradians would cross the aircraft's center line at approximately 400 yards. What emerged by mid-1943 was a systematic approach to fighter gunnery that treated air combat as an engineering problem rather than a test of individual skill. Captain John S. Chennault arrived at the 5th Air Force headquarters in Port Moresby, New Guinea, in July 1943, with orders that seemed impossibly vague: improve fighter gunnery effectiveness. He was 28 years old, a 1937 graduate of MIT, with a degree in mechanical engineering, and he had spent the previous 18 months teaching ballistics at the Army Air Force's Technical Training Command in Denver. He had never fired a gun from an aircraft. He had never flown combat. What he possessed was an engineer's understanding of trajectories, convergence angles, and the mathematics of putting projectiles on target. The problem he inherited was quantifiable and devastating. Combat film analysis from the previous 6 months showed that American fighter pilots were expending an average of 1,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition per confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed. The P-38 Lightning carried 500 rounds per gun for the 4 .50 caliber weapons, a total of 2,000 rounds. This meant pilots were returning from missions with empty guns and minimal results. The Browning M2 machine gun fired at approximately 850 rounds per minute per gun. 4 guns firing simultaneously exhausted their ammunition in less than 40 seconds of continuous fire. Chennault began with the physical evidence. He requested combat gun camera footage from every fighter squadron in theater. The film arrived in heavy metal canisters, hundreds of hours of grainy 16mm footage showing American pilots firing at Japanese aircraft. Sitting in a darkened room with a hand-cranked projector, Chennault watched the same pattern repeat endlessly. American pilots opened fire at ranges exceeding 500 yards. Their tracers arced through empty space around the target. They held the trigger down, spraying ammunition in long, continuous bursts. The Japanese aircraft maneuvered slightly and escaped undamaged. The problem was threefold. First, pilots were firing at excessive ranges where bullet drop and dispersion made hits unlikely. Second, they were firing long bursts instead of short, aimed shots. Third, and most critically, their weapons weren't converged at any consistent range. Some aircraft had guns bore-sighted parallel to the fuselage axis. Others had crude convergence settings established by ground crews using string and chalk marks. The result was 6 or 8 individual bullet streams that never concentrated into a lethal pattern. Chennault established a test program using war-weary P-38 seconds that had accumulated too many combat hours for frontline service. He installed telemetry equipment and set up a firing range over the ocean near Port Moresby. Test pilots flew repeated gunnery passes at towed targets while cameras recorded the bullet patterns. The data was sobering. With no convergence, at 400 yards range, the bullet pattern from a P-38's 4 nose-mounted .50 caliber guns spread across an area approximately 20 feet wide and 15 feet tall. Only 7% of rounds fired passed through a rectangle the size of a Zero's fuselage. With convergence set at 400 yards, the pattern transformed. At that specific range, 92% of rounds passed through the target rectangle. The concentration of fire increased by more than tenfold. A 2-second burst, approximately 100 rounds total, placed 85 to 90 bullets into the target area. The kinetic energy delivered to the target aircraft increased from perhaps 3,000 foot-pounds to over 40,000 foot-pounds. The difference between superficial damage and structural destruction. Chennault standardized convergence at 400 yards for all P-38 squadrons. The choice wasn't arbitrary. It represented the optimal balance between several competing factors. At ranges beyond 400 yards, bullet drop became significant. The 50 caliber round dropped approximately 18 inches between 400 and 500 yards, enough to miss a maneuvering target. At ranges below 300 yards, the pilot risked collision with debris from the destroyed enemy aircraft. 400 yards provided adequate standoff distance while maintaining devastating hit probability. The implementation required retraining ground crews across dozens of squadrons. Chennault developed a standardized armament procedure using surveying transits and reference targets positioned exactly 400 yards from the aircraft. Each gun was individually bore-sighted, its mounting adjusted until the trajectory intersected the reference point. The process took approximately 4 hours per aircraft. Armament sergeants resisted initially, viewing it as unnecessary precision. Chennault made the data available. After reviewing gun camera footage showing the difference in hit probability, resistance evaporated. But convergence was only half the solution. Chennault also had to change how pilots employed their weapons. The fighter tactics manual that arrived at 5th Air Force squadrons in September 1943 bore Chennault's fingerprints throughout. The document, officially titled Gunnery and Fighter Tactics for Southwest Pacific Operations, was 38 pages of dense technical instruction that fundamentally rewrote American fighter doctrine. Unlike previous manuals that emphasized aggressive pursuit and close-range combat, this document treated air combat as a ballistics problem with specific solutions. The core principle was boom and zoom. Dive on the enemy from superior altitude, fire a brief burst at optimal convergence range, then extend away using superior speed. No turning fights. No prolonged engagements. Hit once with devastating effect, then disengage before the enemy could respond. The manual specified firing ranges between 350 and 450 yards, the zone where convergence patterns achieved maximum density. The instructions on firing discipline were revolutionary. Fire in bursts of 1 to 2 seconds duration, the manual stated. Longer bursts waste ammunition and reduce accuracy through gun vibration and recoil forces. A 2-second burst delivers approximately 150 rounds total from all weapons. This is sufficient to destroy any enemy fighter if rounds are concentrated through proper convergence and range discipline. Squadron commanders initially resisted. The prevailing American fighter pilot culture celebrated aggression, individual initiative, and the pursuit of enemy aircraft until they were destroyed or escaped. The idea of firing once and disengaging seemed cowardly. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Lynch, commanding the 39th Fighter Squadron at WWII, summarized the objection. "We're asking pilots to shoot and run. That's not how fighter pilots fight." Chennault's response was documented in a letter preserved in 5th Air Force records. "We're not asking pilots to run. We're asking them to kill efficiently. One properly aimed burst at convergence range will destroy an enemy aircraft. Chasing that aircraft into a turning fight, expending all ammunition in a spray-and-pray attack, gets our pilots killed and accomplishes nothing. The Japanese want us to dogfight. Their aircraft and their pilots are optimized for that combat. We have different advantages: speed, altitude, and concentrated firepower. We should fight our fight, not theirs." The first squadron to fully implement the new doctrine was the 475th Fighter Group, equipped with P-38 Lightnings, which became operational in August 1943. Their commander, Colonel Charles MacDonald, was a pragmatist who cared more about results than tradition. He enforced rigid discipline, 400-yard convergence for every aircraft, mandatory gunnery practice with emphasis on range estimation, and strict tactical discipline prohibiting turning fights with Japanese fighters. The results appeared within weeks. On October 12, 1943, 16 P-38 seconds from the 475th Fighter Group encountered approximately 20 Zeros over WWII. The engagement lasted 8 minutes. American pilots made single high-speed passes, fired brief bursts at ranges between 350 and 400 yards, then extended away. 5 Zeros fell in flames. Not one American aircraft was damaged. The kill ratio was entirely one-sided, unprecedented in Pacific air combat, where exchanges typically produced roughly equal losses. Gun camera footage from that engagement showed the new doctrine in action. Lieutenant Perry Dahl's camera recorded his attack on a Zero at precisely 412 yards range. The convergence was perfect. All 4 50-caliber streams intersected at the Zero's wing root. The burst lasted 1.8 seconds. The Zero's wing separated from the fuselage. The aircraft tumbled earthward, trailing fuel and debris. Dahl didn't pursue. He pushed his throttles to war, emergency power, and climbed away, regaining altitude for another attack. The footage was distributed throughout 5th Air Force as training material. Pilots watched it repeatedly, studying the range, the convergence effect, the discipline of not pursuing after the firing pass. The contrast with earlier combat footage was stark. Where previous gun camera films showed long, wasteful bursts at excessive ranges, this showed surgical precision, brief firing, devastating effect, immediate disengagement. Japanese pilots noticed the change immediately. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, flying from Rabaul during this period, later described his confusion. The American tactics changed completely in late 1943. They refused to dogfight. They dove from above, fired from ranges where we could barely see them clearly, then climbed away before we could respond. Their gunnery became incredibly accurate. Aircraft that would have survived earlier in the war were simply blown apart. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The confirmation that American fighter doctrine had fundamentally changed came during the concentrated air campaign against Rabaul in November 1943. The Japanese base on New Britain's northern coast housed approximately 300 aircraft, making it the strongest concentration of Japanese air power remaining in the Southwest Pacific. 5th Air Force planned a systematic destruction of this capability through repeated heavy bomber raids escorted by overwhelming fighter strength. November 11, 1943, 0630 hours. 75 P-38 Lightnings assembled over Oro Bay on New Guinea's northern coast. The armament status of each aircraft had been verified. Convergence set at 400 yards, ammunition load complete, guns bore-sighted and test-fired. The briefing had been explicit about tactical discipline. Engage enemy fighters using boom and zoom attacks only. Fire at convergence range only. No extended engagements, no turning fights under any circumstances. The formation climbed to 25,000 feet for the flight across the Solomon Sea. The B-25 Mitchell bombers they were escorting cruised at 15,000 feet, forcing the fighters to weave above them to maintain position without overshooting. Japanese radar detected the incoming raid approximately 100 miles out. By the time American aircraft reached Rabaul, roughly 60 Zeros had scrambled and were climbing to intercept. The initial contact occurred at 0845 hours, approximately 15 miles southeast of the target. Japanese fighters climbed in their standard formation, attempting to reach altitude advantage before engaging. They didn't achieve it. American pilots, already at 25,000 feet, rolled into diving attacks that accelerated them past 400 miles per hour. The speed differential made pursuit impossible. Zeros that attempted to follow simply couldn't keep up. First Lieutenant Richard Bong, flying as element leader in the 9th Fighter Squadron, recorded his attack in the post-mission debriefing. I picked a zero climbing at approximately 20,000 feet. Rolled in from 25,000, built speed to 410 indicated. Selected him as target at approximately 1,000 yards, tracked his climb rate, adjusted my dive angle to account for his motion. At 420 yards, I centered the gun sight reticle and fired a 2-second burst. Observed strikes across the wing root and engine cowling. Aircraft exploded immediately. I continued my dive to 15,000 feet, then climbed back to escort altitude. Bong's combat film showed exactly what he described. The Zero filled his gun sight at 400 yards range. The convergence zone struck the aircraft like a physical blow. Pieces of aluminum skin tore away. The engine cowling disintegrated. Fire erupted from the wing root fuel tank. The entire sequence from first shots to complete destruction took less than 3 seconds. The kinetic energy delivered by approximately 150 50 caliber rounds, all concentrated into an area roughly 6 feet in diameter, simply overwhelmed the Zero's lightweight structure. This pattern repeated across the engagement. American pilots dove, fired at convergence range, and extended away. Japanese pilots attempted to turn into the attacks, relying on their superior maneuverability to achieve firing position. But the Americans weren't there to be turned on. By the time a Zero completed its turn, the attacking P-38 was already 3 miles away, climbing back to altitude for another pass. The engagement lasted approximately 22 minutes. When American aircraft turned for home, 20 Zeros lay scattered across the waters southeast of Rabaul. 2 P-38 seconds had been damaged by return fire, but both made it back to base. No American aircraft were lost. The exchange ratio was 10-1 in America's favor, an inversion of the ratios that had prevailed 18 months earlier. Japanese after-action reports from Rabaul that day revealed the psychological impact. One surviving Zero pilot, whose account was captured in post-war interviews, described the experience. "We couldn't fight them. They attacked from above with tremendous speed. We never had time to maneuver into firing position. When they fired, their concentration of bullets was unbelievable. Aircraft simply came apart. Then they were gone before we could respond. It was like fighting ghosts. We couldn't force them to fight our kind of battle. The mathematical reality of convergence zones at 400 yards, combined with tactical discipline that refused Japanese strengths, had transformed the air war in the Pacific. What had seemed like Japanese aerial invincibility in 1942 now appeared as a tactical approach that Americans had simply learned to counter. The Zero's maneuverability became irrelevant when American pilots refused to dogfight. Japanese pilot skill became meaningless when engagements lasted 3 seconds and occurred at ranges beyond effective return fire. The success over Rabaul in November 1943 forced a complete reassessment of fighter tactics throughout the Pacific theater. 5th Air Force had proven that systematic gunnery discipline and tactical restraint could overcome Japanese aerial superiority. The question became whether this approach could be replicated across other commands, other aircraft types, and ultimately throughout the entire American fighter force in the Pacific. The Navy faced a particularly urgent need for improved gunnery. Carrier-based fighters operated under different constraints than land-based aircraft. They had limited fuel, restricted ammunition loads, and needed to return to ships that might be under attack. The F-6F Hellcat, which began reaching fleet squadrons in early 1943, carried 650 caliber machine guns with 400 rounds per gun, approximately 30 seconds of sustained fire. Every round had to count. Commander John Thash, who had developed the famous Thash-Weave defensive tactic, was assigned to analyze the 5th Air Force gunnery data in December 1943. His report to the Bureau of Aeronautics was unequivocal. Land-based units in the Southwest Pacific have demonstrated that proper convergence settings and tactical discipline can achieve kill ratios of 8-1 or better against experienced Japanese pilots. We must implement identical procedures for carrier aviation immediately. The Navy standardized convergence at 300 yards for carrier fighters, slightly closer than the Army Air Force's preference. The reasoning was documented in Bureau of Aeronautics Technical Order Number 47-1944. Carrier engagements typically occur at lower altitudes where visibility is better and ranges are shorter. 300-yard convergence provides maximum hit density while allowing pilots to visually confirm target identification before firing. This reduces friendly fire incidents and improves ammunition efficiency. Implementation required retraining every carrier air group. Gunnery officers flew to established carriers to supervise convergence procedures. Gun camera footage from successful engagements was compiled into training films. The emphasis shifted from individual marksmanship to systematic application of ballistics principles. As one training film narrator explained, "You are not trying to hit the target with individual bullets. You are placing a cone of destruction at a specific point in space. The target flies into that cone. Physics does the rest." The results appeared during the Marianas Turkey shoot on June 19, 1944. Over 300 Japanese carrier aircraft attacked the American fleet in multiple waves. Navy fighters, properly converged and employing boom and zoom tactics, destroyed approximately 240 Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 30 American fighters. The exchange ratio approached 8-1, nearly identical to what 5th Air Force had achieved over Rabaul 7 months earlier. Japanese losses weren't just numerical. The pilots killed over the Marianas represented the last experienced cadre of carrier aviators Japan possessed. These weren't novices with minimal training. Many had accumulated hundreds of combat hours. But experience couldn't overcome the mathematics of convergence zones and the tactical discipline to employ them effectively. American pilots fired brief bursts at optimal ranges. Japanese aircraft disintegrated. The pattern repeated across hundreds of individual engagements. By mid-1944, the doctrine had spread to every American fighter unit in the Pacific. The P-47 Thunderbolt squadrons in the Central Pacific adopted 400-yard convergence for their .850 caliber weapons. Marine Corps F-4U Corsair squadrons standardized at 350 yards. Even the P-51 Mustang units arriving for long-range escort duty over Japan used identical convergence procedures. The systematic approach that Captain Chennault had pioneered became universal American fighter doctrine. The Japanese attempted to adapt. Their training programs emphasized higher speed attacks and longer firing ranges, but Japanese aircraft weren't designed for high-speed combat. The Zero's lightweight structure suffered control problems at speeds above 350 miles per hour. Attempting to match American boom and zoom tactics in an aircraft optimized for turning fights produced poor results. Japanese pilots found themselves fighting in a manner their aircraft and their training hadn't prepared them for. Saburo Sakai, who survived the war and wrote extensively about Japanese naval aviation, summarized the transformation. By late 1944, we knew we couldn't win air battles against the Americans. Their gunnery had become too accurate. Their tactics gave us no opportunity to use our advantages. We fought because duty demanded it, but we knew the outcome was predetermined. The Americans had learned to fight their war, not ours. The cost of this learning had been paid in American blood during 1942 and early 1943. But by late 1943, the investment in systematic gunnery and tactical discipline was producing returns that changed the entire character of the Pacific Air War. The men who developed and implemented convergence gunnery paid prices that extended beyond the war itself. Captain John Chennault returned to the United States in March 1945 after 21 months in the Southwest Pacific. He had lost 40 pounds. He suffered from recurring malaria contracted in New Guinea. His hearing was permanently damaged from months spent near aircraft engines and gunfire on improvised test ranges. He was 29 years old and looked 50. The Army Air Forces awarded him the Legion of Merit for his work on fighter gunnery, but the citation was classified. The specific details of convergence patterns, firing ranges, and ballistic data remained military secrets through the end of the war. Chennault couldn't discuss his work publicly. His family never fully understood what he had done in the Pacific. He returned to MIT in 1946 to complete a doctorate in mechanical engineering, teaching ballistics courses that drew heavily on his wartime experience without ever explicitly referencing it. The pilots who flew with converged weapons and tactical discipline faced different costs. Richard Bong, who became America's highest-scoring ace with 40 confirmed victories, was killed in August 1945 testing a P-80 jet fighter in California. He was 24 years old. Thomas Lynch, who had initially resisted the new tactical doctrine before becoming one of its most effective practitioners, was shot down over Taji in March 1944. He was 29. Charles MacDonald, who commanded the 475th Fighter Group and enforced rigid gunnery discipline, survived the war but struggled with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress. He rarely spoke about his wartime service. The Japanese pilots who faced American Convergence gunnery paid the highest price. Of the approximately 3,500 experienced naval aviators Japan possessed in December 1941, fewer than 100 survived the war. The attrition rate was 97%. Many died in combat against properly converged American fighters. Others were killed in training accidents as Japan desperately tried to replace losses with minimally trained replacements. Some survived combat only to die in kamikaze attacks during the war's final year. Saburo Sakai, one of the few high-scoring Japanese aces to survive, spent decades after the war trying to explain what had happened to Japanese naval aviation. In his memoir, Samurai, published in 1957, he wrote, "We were trained to believe that spirit and skill could overcome any material disadvantage. This was true in 1942, when American pilots tried to fight our type of battle. It became catastrophically false when they learned to fight their own way. We couldn't adapt because our entire system, from aircraft design to tactical doctrine to pilot training, was optimized for one kind of combat. When that combat became obsolete, we had nothing to replace it with." The ground crews, who bore-sighted weapons and set convergence patterns, rarely received recognition. These were sergeants and corporals, enlisted men who worked 18-hour days in tropical heat, using surveying equipment to adjust gun mounts to tolerances measured in milliradians. Their work was invisible when done correctly. Only failures, weapons that didn't converge properly, or guns that jammed in combat drew attention. After the war, most returned to civilian life, without anyone knowing what they had contributed. The institutional legacy proved more durable than individual recognition. The United States Air Force, established as an independent service in 1947, incorporated convergence, gunnery, and boom and zoom tactics into its foundational doctrine. The Aerial Gunnery School at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada taught these principles to every fighter pilot through the Korean War and into the jet age. Even after guns were supplemented by guided missiles, the underlying tactical philosophy, refuse the enemy's preferred engagement and impose your own strengths, remained central to American fighter doctrine. The mathematical principles that made convergence effective at 400 yards, with 50 caliber weapons applied equally to 20mm cannon, to radar-guided missiles, and eventually to modern beyond visual range combat. The specific technology changed. The underlying logic, understand your weapons' capabilities and employ them at optimal ranges while denying the enemy his preferred engagement, remained constant. The Japanese self-defense forces, established during the American occupation, studied their own defeat exhaustively. The Air Tactics Manual, adopted by the Japan Air Self-Defense Force in 1954, incorporated boom and zoom principles and convergence patterns. Former Japanese pilots who had survived the war helped write the manual, applying lessons learned at terrible cost. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. Japan's post-war Air Force learned to fight using the tactics that had defeated them. By the 1960s, when declassification allowed publication of detailed Pacific War histories, the story of convergence gunnery entered the historical record. But it remained largely a technical footnote, interesting to aviation enthusiasts, but overshadowed by more dramatic narratives of carrier battles and strategic bombing campaigns. The morning of November 18, 1943, when Second Lieutenant Robert Westbrook destroyed a Zero at 400 yards over Rabaul, represented more than a tactical victory. It marked the moment when systematic analysis overcame intuitive combat, when engineering discipline defeated individual skill, when the Americans finally learned to fight their own war rather than the war their enemy wanted. The Japanese had spent decades perfecting a form of aerial combat that emphasized agility, close-range gunnery, and pilot skill. They built aircraft optimized for turning fights. They trained pilots for years in acrobatic maneuvers. They developed tactical doctrine around the assumption that superior maneuverability would always prevail in close combat. This assumption was entirely reasonable. It had been validated in China, in the Philippines, over Java and Burma, and the Solomon Islands. For 18 months, Japanese aerial supremacy seemed unshakable. What they hadn't anticipated was an enemy willing to refuse that type of combat entirely. The Americans couldn't build fighters that turned as tightly as the Zero. They couldn't train pilots with the same depth of experience. What they could do was apply industrial precision to the problem of getting bullets on target. They could standardize convergence patterns. They could develop tactical doctrine that played to American strengths, speed and firepower, and systematic discipline, while negating Japanese advantages. The transformation wasn't dramatic. There was no single breakthrough moment, no wonder weapon that changed everything overnight. Instead, it was the accumulation of small improvements, proper convergence settings, standardized gunnery procedures, tactical discipline enforced through training and leadership. These incremental changes, applied systematically across hundreds of squadrons and thousands of pilots, produced revolutionary results. By mid-1944, American fighters routinely achieved kill ratios of 5-to-1 or better against Japanese opposition. This wasn't because American pilots had suddenly become more skilled or because Japanese pilots had become less capable. It was because the Americans had learned to impose their preferred type of combat. They dove from altitude, fired at convergence range, and extended away before the Japanese could respond. The mathematics of ballistics ensured that brief bursts at 400 yards delivered devastating hit density. Japanese maneuverability became irrelevant because there was nothing to maneuver against. The deeper lesson extended beyond aerial gunnery. It revealed something fundamental about technological warfare in the industrial age. Victory didn't necessarily come to the side with the most skilled individual operators or the most agile weapons. Victory came to the side that could systematically analyze problems, develop solutions based on engineering principles rather than tradition, and implement those solutions across entire organizations. The Americans didn't outfight the Japanese pilot for pilot, they out-systematized them. This lesson would repeat throughout World War II and in subsequent conflicts. German tanks had superior armor and guns, but American tanks were more reliable and more numerous. Japanese soldiers fought with suicidal dedication, but American logistics ensured their forces never lacked ammunition or supplies. Individual superiority mattered less than systematic superiority. Excellence in execution mattered less than excellence in planning and logistics. The men who worked out convergence patterns in 1943, who trained pilots in firing discipline, who enforced tactical doctrine despite resistance from traditionalists, understood this intuitively. They were fighting an engineering war, not a romance. Their weapons were mathematics and standardization, not individual heroism. The victory they achieved was quieter than the dramatic carrier battles or amphibious assaults, but no less decisive. When the war ended in August 1945, American air superiority over Japan was absolute. Fighters ranged freely over Japanese cities. Bombers operated without significant opposition. The transformation from the desperate defensive battles of 1942 to complete aerial dominance in 1945 had many causes. Superior American industrial production, the replacement pilot training systems that sustained combat strength, technological advantages in radar and communications. But underlying all of it was the systematic approach to combat that convergence gunnery represented. The Japanese had entered the war believing that spirit and skill could overcome material disadvantage. They learned, at terrible cost, that industrial warfare didn't work that way. The Americans had entered the war with inadequate doctrine and minimal gunnery training. They learned, through analysis and systematic improvement, how to transform material advantages into battlefield dominance. The difference between these approaches, between tradition and analysis, between individual skill and systematic excellence, determined the outcome of the Pacific Air War. Second Lieutenant Robert Westbrook, who fired that burst at 400 yards over Rabaul in November 1943, probably never fully understood the larger significance of what he had done. He followed his training, applied his weapons at optimal range, and destroyed an enemy aircraft. For him, it was one engagement among many. But that moment, replicated thousands of times across the Pacific, represented the transformation of American fighter aviation from a force that fought on enemy terms to one that imposed its own will on the battlefield. The convergence zone at 400 yards wasn't just a ballistic phenomenon. It was the physical manifestation of a new way of thinking about war. And once the Americans learned to think that way, the outcome was never really in doubt. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.